Thank you, Marco, and thank you to friends in SEDET for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. What I thought would be useful would be to simply share some ideas and proposals for what ecological democracy could look like. We have some sense of where we are as a society, as a world, as a species. We seem to have very little sense as to where we want to go, and even if we have some sense of that, we perhaps have even less of an idea as to how to get there. So I'll focus my reflections on the latter two things. In our book, Ashish and I actually discuss at some length what we mean by ecological democracy. I'm going to amend it slightly and use the expression Harit Swaraj. And Harit Swaraj does not have an easy translation into English, merely because I don't think Swaraj has a good translation in English. Democracy is a very poor word before Swaraj. I think we can spend a long time discussing what Swaraj means, but the only thing I will say right now is that in a true proper sense, what Gandhiji as well as his predecessors who used that expression meant by it was in some sense the epitome of individual freedom, obtainable only in the presence of a community. And this is an idea that goes back many centuries in our traditions, as well as in Western thought. For instance, Aristotle in the Ethics talks about how an individual cannot come into his or her own without a community. A community is necessary for the fulfillment of individual potential. Individual freedom has no meaning if the individual can simply get up and run away from not just a community but from all communities, which is the default definition of individual freedom in a world of the sort we live in today. So so-called liberal democracy has made a mockery of the concept of individual freedom simply because it has failed to defend the rights of the community. The modern West has given us a rich sort of set of ideas about individual rights and human rights and so on, but none of them actually contain one of the prerequisites of individual freedom in its highest sense, which is the defense of collective rights. All the modern jurisprudence is about individuals as though they are social atoms, as though they are not really members of a community. And if you look at the etymological origin of the word individual, it actually comes from the 12th, 13th centuries in Europe, and it means that which cannot be divided. And nothing or no one is more divided today than the individual. Our private lives are handed over to corporations now, and our public lives are handed over to the state, and the community is conspicuous by its absence. Instead, we have networks and social media networks like Facebook to sort of serve as a surrogate community. So I see the idea of Swaraj as standing against all of this. The idea of democracy is not against all of this. So that's just a sort of prefatory clarification I wanted to do. So I would rather use the word Harit Swaraj than ecological democracy. That's one clarification. The other terminological clarification which is necessary is to distinguish between the environmental and the ecological. And if one thinks about it carefully, what one understands is this. If you look at policies in this country, or indeed around the world anywhere today, what you find is everybody's concerned about quote-unquote the environment, right? And the environment is sort of an afterthought to all the rest of the policy framework. So after we've sorted out the economy and our own interests, then we will think about saving trees and tigers and cleaning up the water and so on. Now, going by Modi ji's most recent announcements and government by ordinance and so on, what we are finding is that that core thinking has not only not changed compared to the Congress government, but has actually become worse in defining its sort of corporate core and its growth fetish much more clearly, much more amply. So the environment truly is an afterthought now. In an ecological way of thinking, you think in an integrated way about not just nature as it stands outside of us, but see ourselves as part of nature, see human culture, human society, human community, everything human as actually part of a much larger web of life that is present on this planet. One does not separate oneself philosophically, epistemologically. One does not separate oneself from the rest of nature as though one can stand outside of it, as though a branch of a tree can stand outside the tree and decide whether the tree is worthwhile for it or not. Okay? So the way I understand ecological democracy is as a survival imperative. We have no other option in the long run if we are to survive as a species, as a human society of any civilized substance, unless we turn towards some of these alternatives. About 100 years ago, Rabindranath Tagore said something very important. He said, India's problem is the world's problem in miniature. And he also said, it does India no good, I'm quoting verbatim, it does India no good to compete with Western civilization in its own field. So what I want to propose to you today is that the prevailing policy regime in this country, which pretends to be nationalistic, is actually openly and blindly imitative of what remains of Western civilization today, which is a lot of supermarkets and expressways, fundamentally. India's ambitions about turning itself into a superpower is actually a very recent one. It wasn't there before the 1990s, certainly not there in our constitution or any such thing. Even the word development occurs just twice in our constitution. The word growth is absent from our constitution. So this ambition of turning India into a superpower is actually foisted upon us. And it's been foisted upon us very consciously by Western media, by Wall Street especially. Since the 1990s, India has been seen as a sort of counterfoil to China and serving as sort of an American geopolitical counterpoint to Chinese power and so on in this part of the world. And so if China is heading towards superpower status, so must India, otherwise how will it serve that role? Our suborned and co-opted unimaginable elites have simply taken upon themselves the ambition that has been foisted upon them. Before the 1990s, if you recall, those of us who were young enough at that time will recall that there was no such ambition of turning India into a superpower. That vocabulary was not there. This was post-Cold War. What I want to suggest is that actually India does have a major role in the world, but not in the way our elites think. So what we argue in our book is that India's role is actually to serve as an ecological pioneer. And India is uniquely placed to serve that role, which is why I quoted Rabindranath saying that India's problem is the world's problem in miniature. Because given the scale of our problems, given the diversity of the country, given the speed at which things are going down, it's necessary for India to get its act together on its own terms, on its own culturally unique terms. And if India can get it right, then there will be a model before the world which can serve as an alternative to the default, which I read as not neoliberalism as leftists like to think, but as corporate totalitarianism, to use the right word. Neoliberalism is neither very new nor very liberal. So let's build a smarter planet variety of corporate totalitarianism is the default, and we are all invited to a war between capital and nature, we have to sort of take our position somewhere on that spectrum and ultimately get consumed in the crossfire. That is the sort of default. So if we understand that role correctly, that we have the opportunity to serve as an ecological pioneer, then how is that role best served? And I think that I would like to put forward some ideas for towards that. I've written a sort of a draft. It's a very, very tentative draft of my reflections right now. I am not going to cover everything that there is here in writing, but I will simply mention that there are many, many reasons, at least a dozen odd reasons which I've given here, for believing that the present policy regimes are so unstable that it's more than likely that they're going to fall within many of our lifetimes. And when they fall, the chaos that will ensue will be dramatic if there is no alternative vision in place, and if there is no way to convince powerful policy elites that we need to change course radically. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but what I will say is that the understanding that a lot of people have today, taking off from Amartya Sen's view, that development is a kind of freedom. Development as Freedom is the title of his book, published about 15 years ago. I would like to say, in very brief, that development is best understood as a form of war. And I'll go through very quickly some of the reasons why I think so. Now, if you look at war, the primary purpose of war is domination. The primary goal of war is victory. There are winners and losers. If you look at development today, it's hard to understand development as it's actually operating on the ground, as well as how policies are being constructed, if you ignore the language of winners and losers. Everything is about winners and losers. The argument being made to us is that the winners are winning so much that they can more than compensate the losers for their losses. So whether it's land acquisition or anything else, that is the logic being sold. So trickle down through the sort of mainstream mechanisms of the system has ceased to function. Even the best advocates of trickle down do not really believe it happens on its own. It has to be done actively by an interventionist state, and we have the resources to do it. So that's what we are being told, and it is clearly about winners and losers. Secondly, competition is the cornerstone of the modern economy. Where does competition come from? If you trace it historically or psychologically, you will at some point hit upon war. There is no system of modernity independent of warfare. Warfare was not only necessary in the past to create the conditions for the modern economy, leaving competition as the lasting sort of feature of the modern economy, but war is also necessary to sustain the modern economy. That is to say, to keep the supply lines of empire flowing. Okay. If there are to be no jams in the oil and gas supplies, water and so on, you need to go on and fight anybody who stands in the way, whether it's for their own rights or to defend their country or whatever. Other aspects of war which carry over to development are instability, uncertainty, insecurity, the need for a strategy, fundamental to warfare. Everybody talks in terms of a development strategy today. Insecurity is fundamental to the modern economy. If there's one common denominator to all the advertising that we see 24/7 on television or internet or anywhere, it's to actually make human beings anxious. Whatever potential for anxiety and insecurity we have, whatever fears we might have, real or imagined, have to be stoked and constantly kept alive in order to sell you the commodity or the service which will address those fears, which will take care of those fears. So insecurity is very, very central to the whole thing, and in that sense, development is very much like war. It's also like war if you think in terms of the takings of the winners. In a war, the victor takes everything. In development, the way it's happening today, if you look at our salaries, if you look at the returns from the stock market, if you look at the kind of money paid to sportsmen or celebrities, the winner does take all. And there's a big difference between number one and being number two. Being number two is no good, being number one is everything. Like war, development also relies on secrecy and opacity. And the ethic of secrecy, so to speak, runs through not just corporate norms, but also in the way governments are increasingly functioning and so on. More and more relevant decision-making areas have been rendered opaque to the public, the constant demand for transparency notwithstanding. In both cases, decisions are made by strategists in remote locations, and modern technologies make that eminently possible. You sit in a control room from where you can master the drones, which are delivering weapons to innocents thousands of miles away. Development operates pretty much the same way. You sit in Washington or London or New Delhi or Bhubaneswar, and you take decisions which are inflicted on unsuspecting people all over the country. Finally, like war, development is also an exclusive enterprise. Every piece of advertising is there to make you feel special. You are the most important person in the world, and you are going to be the member of a special club if you buy this product, and so on, so on, so on. In the limiting case, it also eliminates people, right? Because, like I said, the logic is that by eliminating a community or by eliminating a culture, if you can create enough material benefits somewhere else, then those people can be taxed by governments and made to compensate the ones who lose, etc. The fact that intangibles have a value which you can't put money to does not figure in the account books and is not relevant for economists, simply because those are not things that can be measured. Which is the reason when we quote Einstein in our book that all that's countable is not worth counting, and all that's worth counting is not countable. But that's not a piece of wisdom or insight which is relevant for our policy elites today. They've barbarized themselves to the point of making that irrelevant. So these are the reasons why I believe that the Amartya Sen kind of view is not only wrong, it is misleading, suicidal in the extreme to believe that development is a form of freedom in the face of all the evidence that we have. I think that one needs to keep this on the table somewhere on the side, that this is the default setting, this is what is actually going on, and whatever we think of by way of an alternative vision must find a way to address this. No matter that we are constantly being told what is the solution, don't just criticize, etc. But whatever solution we create has to come from an approach, has to come from a perspective which is not only imaginative and creative in the best sense, but is also critical. If you think of an alternative which is not critical, which is not going to deal with the elephant in the room, then that elephant will simply consume whatever you create, and that's not very difficult to imagine. Okay, now I want to get to the sort of key features of what I describe as Harit Swaraj, and I will sort of briefly talk about 10 or 12 different things which I think we need to address if we are thinking of a properly distinct vision which would be both sustainable and just in the long run. There are three basic principles from which everything I say stems. The first is ecological sustainability. The obvious fact that we are now faced with a survival imperative as a species, and there's no way to avoid it in a central sort of way. The second is the concern with equity and justice. Equity does not mean literal economic equality, it simply means a consistent concern with equality. remembering that when inequalities widen beyond a certain point, societies become extremely unstable and insecure. Like a fruit-bearing tree which only bears fruit on one side will collapse. Likewise, societies also tend to collapse under those conditions. And the third sort of principle, the underlying principle on which everything else is based, is the obvious fact of not only India's diversity, but the world's diversity. And when we say diversity, we don't just mean cultural diversity, distinct languages and ethnic backgrounds and languages and so on, but also the agroecological biodiversity, which varies so much across this country and the rest of the world. So based on these three things, these are some of the norms which follow if we are to think in terms of Harit Swaraj. The first important thing would be localization of economies. What characterizes modern economies is remoteness. Action happens at a distance. A decision is made in London or Washington or Singapore or Delhi, and it has consequences 5 or 10,000 miles away. And this is quite routine. Now, this has all sorts of problems and issues which should be thought about, but are not thought about because of the totalitarian nature of the political system we now live in. But the fact is that one major reason why economies have become ecologically unsustainable is because of remote decision making, remote controlled economics. So this has to change fundamentally, and economies have to be much more localized and much more regionalized from below, from the grassroots up. So while it may not be feasible to think in terms of a 100% self-sufficient village, it is possible to think in terms of, if not 100%, an 80 or 90% self-sufficient region, a cluster of villages, maybe 50 or 100, which are part of a certain region, which are actually able to look after most of their requirements from that region itself. And I'm not talking pie in the sky. I mean, in our book, we cite examples of places which are actually doing this, which are actually experimenting with this, and sometimes quite successfully. So that would be one major norm or principle that will follow. The second one is cooperation. And to see cooperation as always an ongoing project, very difficult to achieve in practice because of the default setting, which is competition. This sort of alienation that people live with on a normal basis nowadays, whether in urban areas or even in the countryside, that stands in the way, it sort of offers a kind of cynicism about cooperation. But we should not forget the forces which are eroding these possibilities and which are constantly challenging the existence of communities, good or bad. Cooperation would involve two dimensions, the lateral dimension as well as the vertical dimension. So cooperation at the same sort of social level or strata, as well as across levels, which usually involve hierarchies of power, and those will have to be worked with to create new political arrangements. The role of women is critical to ecological sustainability and communities. Women have always been the anchor of human communities across time and space, and cultures and ecologies, to the extent that they have survived, they owe a lot of this to conservation habits and practices which are embodied in the way women live their lives. For Harit Swaraj to become a reality one day, their role is therefore quite critical. The fourth principle which we discuss is bioregionalism. We understand that ecological problems do not obey national or cultural boundaries. They follow the pattern of the landscape, the bioregion of which we are talking about. So, which means that political units should be such as to make planning for a whole bioregion possible. That might be the Himalayas, that might be the Western Ghats, that might be the Sahara Desert, etc. So I'm flagging these things. This is a particularly difficult area because of obvious political constraints and obstacles on the way. But the South Asian landmass is actually an ideal place to experiment with these approaches, given the challenges, given the actual diversity and so on. Democratic governance, to put it very mildly actually, is a must. Now in a country like India, which has a three-tier system of government, the third tier is usually at the receiving end, which is to say two things. It never has veto power over decisions taken above. Despite the Johnson-wise and now with the Modi government in place, even less would public hearings matter in environmental and other cases. So that veto power, which the third tier must have for a good ecological democracy, is something which will have to be fought for. When I was working in Europe some years back, I noticed that in places like Norway and Switzerland, very often the third tier, it's usually the commune, the canton, they have powers whereby they can overrule decisions taken in parliaments above them if it does not suit their local needs and interests. So that's one. And the second is the third tier in India is the panchayat is usually not a law-making body. It simply executes laws which are made either by the center or at the state level. And the third tier has to become a law-making body as well. If you're talking about ecological democracy properly conceived, then the local government ought to be empowered to create laws in the local interest. The argument is often heard that you can't give this much local power to local governments because elites at the local level will corner that and will use it to their advantage. Strangely, the same argument is not made about giving power to the central or the state government. They, after all, do exactly the same thing, but there, we exempt them from the same sort of, proviso. So I think a lot of discussion needs to happen on these two issues of democratic governance in relation to Harit Swaraj. Indigenous knowledge and education would be the next point. It's been seen many times that there is actually no replacement for local knowledge and experience. And this has nothing to do with literacy, as we know. I've said this before in other forums. Some of the people who survived the tsunami best were actually the Jarawas in the Andamans who followed the animals to the highlands well in advance of the earthquake. And the very literate tourists who were sunbathing at the beach, they lost their lives. And there are 100 other examples you can think of where local knowledge is what matters for good, sound, timely decision making. So this knowledge not only has to be given due respect, in the framework of ecological democracy, it has to have a central place. And we have to find a way to respect the knowledge of those elderly Adivasi women who can tell you about maybe 2,000 or 3,000 different kinds of herbs, which will not even be known to our best botanists. So clearly there is a cognitive issue there. The next point is about livelihood security. Now, by now it's a commonplace to say that the modern economy simply cannot generate the kind of employment which it is routinely displacing. For every 10 or 15 people it displaces, it creates maybe 1 or 2 jobs, and that too at a very different level from the jobs that are destroyed. Now, what is destroyed is not just jobs, but as we know, livelihoods. So which is why one needs to tie that in with a whole way of life which has to be protected. The only way to generate the requisite number of livelihoods is actually the revival of local cultures and ecologies. Without that, it can't be done. Which means a minimum of government intervention from the top. Actually, as Gandhi and for that matter Karl Marx also recognize, all that the rich need to do usually is to get off the backs of the poor, but they think they have a bigger role in eliminating poverty. Most of the time they create more poverty in trying to eliminate it. There are many surviving examples of innovative communities which are actually reviving and building on their practices. In our book we give several examples. At the policy level, it is critical that the government is forced to recognize crafts as industry. There are over 800 different crafts listed by the government of India, but none of them are entitled to the kind of attention, especially economic attention, that industry gets. So in terms of upgradation technologically, in terms of marketing, in terms of credit support, small loans, etc., it's critical that these crafts be described as industry and be treated as such. Now, it'll make a sea change to the way things are done in this country, and Mr. Modi wouldn't have to go around the globe with a begging bowl saying, please make in India. Enough is already being made and can be made. It's just a matter of affording it due respect and having the right sort of patriotism. Other countries, some countries I visited in East Asia have done a splendid job of this kind of thing. Far less powerful countries than India. Countries like Thailand and Indonesia have are actually way ahead of a place like India when it comes to treating crafts with appropriate respect. The formal language of development talks about rural non-farm employment and takes a deterministic view of crafts, that crafts are a thing of the past, only romantics will think about it, only people who believe in some idyllic past will imagine it as part of the future and so on. Not true. I mean, the case studies we've cited in our book which actually demonstrate that there are many other pathways through which these things can develop in areas like textile, fabrics and others. And it is being done. It's being done in more than one part of the country that I know. The next point is about agriculture, and we have to resume seeing agriculture as very much a central part of the matrix. The kind of sort of psychological attitude that people have developed towards agriculture is that not only is it uneconomical, haath ka kaam kaun karega? So we have a particular distaste for working with our hands. One reason for India's backwardness in so many ways. And that has to go. And I think that in a properly conceived Harit Swaraj, agriculture would be at the center of life in some sense. And a whole set of economic activities would center around it. Some of them would be industrial, some of them would be service activities, some of them would be infrastructural, some of them would be energy related, but agriculture has to be at the center. And if we don't think along those lines, then prepare for more of the same, which is to say more farmer suicides, more ecological devastation, more of the second or the third green revolution and its ecological consequences. A few more points remain. One is a fundamentally altered town and country or city and countryside relationship. The global developmental dynamic of modernity has pushed billions of people out of rural areas towards industrial lives in the city. They've basically been uprooted and communities have been eviscerated in order to make an industrial way of life possible. Interesting thing is, which we point out in the book, is that there's no case of a democracy ever having done this. India is the first experiment in that direction. In other words, whether you look at North America, Europe, Japan, China, Soviet Union, in every case the country industrialized and uprooted large numbers of people from the countryside and moved them to the city when it did not have 100% adult suffrage. So there's not a single instance in history of a large country industrializing under properly democratic conditions. When I say properly democratic, I only mean electorally properly democratic conditions. So in other words, I mean, and Mr. Sen and others have to face this brutal fact, if you want to industrialize a country along modern lines, first abandon any dream of a democracy and put that aside. They don't want to face it, they don't want to say it, they don't want to talk about it. Now, back to the city and country thing, one reason for the global ecological crisis is precisely the growing alienation from nature because of heavy urbanization. And we are looking at a future where we are being constantly told that by 2040 or 2050, 3/4 of humanity will be living in urban areas and so on. Now you can imagine the ecological consequences which stem from that. So we argue in our book that the question can only be addressed if the strains in this relationship between town and country are dealt with in a democratic and mutually respectful manner, which is another way of saying that you have to have ecological democracy, otherwise the countryside is going to be short-shrifted. Policies are made in cities, they're not made in villages. Okay? So our priorities are metropolitan, and we assume that by doing this, we can lift everybody up to a globally acceptable standard of living. And philosophically speaking, it's very obvious to me there is a fallacy of composition here. It's like if every two-wheeler owner in this city, including bicycle owners, start thinking that they can own a motor car and Delhi will still run, it will not run. Okay, so it's very obvious there's a fallacy of composition. What's good for some cannot be good for all. So that sort of bad thinking, is all over our policy making today, and that has no place in a rigorously conceived Harit Swaraj, I argue. So this global developmental dynamic of eternal migration to some urban utopia, this has to be reversed. And the answer is not building smart cities, so to speak, if by smart is meant having the same kind of amenities and standard of living as global metros do, because that's simply not possible, but to actually have an adapted environment, which is intelligent at learning from the past and creating a different future. The next point is about energy and about decentralized renewable energy. The basis of the heavy metropolitan industrialization of the world during the past century has been fossil fuels. As they begin to vanish and climate change catches up with more and more parts of the world, the need to move to a different energy foundation for economic well-being is urgent. So many alternatives from biomass to solar and wind exist, but their commercial viability depends on ecologically astute decisions at every level, beginning at the top. So long as companies control this research and they want to make the last buck on oil or on coal, there's not much headway we can expect in this direction. So without much public pressure, the appropriate amount of research and the appropriate amount of commercialization of these energy sources is not going to happen. There's a lot of thinking that people have already done. I've spoken to energy scientists who've done a lot of thinking on smart grids, local grids, etc., which rely on renewables and so on. Economic democracy is the next point. Everybody wants democratization of consumption, but nobody wants democratization of production or distribution. But without the latter, it is difficult to see how sustainable local economies can be built. In India, the long tradition of mandis and haats must be revived and strengthened in order to promote local economies. Mandis have been appropriated for purposes of national economic policy. They need to be returned to where they belong, and their role in local economies needs to be recovered. And finally, the role of the state. Now, even under the most radical ecological democracy conceivable, the state will have a role, especially with respect to international relations and for transport and energy infrastructure sometimes, where they're understood to be necessary after democratic assessment and so on. However, the power of the state at the top would be contained strongly by countervailing power emanating from the grassroots. So the structure, the internal structure of the state we conceive of is going to be very different from anything that prevails today. Now, of course, all this is an idealistic manifesto, and we can discuss at length how one may think of a transition to a world like this. But first, we must be clear as to what kind of world we are looking for before we discuss the transition. All of these are, whether taken alone or taken together, very radical changes from the world we live in. In our book, we argue that this may seem impossible to many people, but what's happening right now is a lot more insane and is actually a lot more utopian. In other words, the contest is really between two utopias: the market utopia, where everybody is going to live like, you know, an upper-class global Indian, and the kind of utopia which we are drawing, which is actually a lot more modest. So those of us who are high up on the ladder of consumption might need to do some stepping down in order to bring up those who are nearer the bottom. Taking more than my time. Thank you.